Just getting ready to start chapter 17. In the last chapter, Billy and little Ann had won the silver cup for her being the best looking dog, and they got through the first round of the championship, and were now in the finals. So it was their night to go out, so they were headed out with their judge. Looking up at the sky, Pop said, "That doesn't look good up there. I think we are in for a storm." The sky had turned to dark gray. Fast-moving clouds were rolling through the heavens. Grandpa said, "Looks like we're going to get some wind, too." Scared and thinking everybody might want to stop hunting because of a few clouds, I said, "If a storm is brewing, it's a good night to go hunt. All the game stirs just before a storm." 30 minutes later, Papa said, "Listen." We stood still. A low, moaning sound could be heard in the tops of the tall sycamores. Grandpa said, "I was afraid of that. We're going to get some wind." We heard the rattling in the leaves and the underbrush. It was beginning to sleet. The air turned cold and chilly. From far downriver, we heard the deep baying of a hound on the trail. It was old Dan. Seconds later, the rhythmic crying of little Ann could be heard. Swallowing the lump I had just jumped into my throat, I whooped as loud as I could. The ground was turning white with sleet. The storm had really set in. We hurried along. I said to Papa, "If this keeps up, that old coon won't run long. He'll head for his den." "If it gets much worse," Grandpa said, "I know some coon hunters that won't be running for very long. They'll be frozen too stiff to run." The judge asked if there was any danger of getting lost. "I don't know," Papa said. "It's all strange country to me." My dogs' voices sounded far away. I knew they were much closer than they sounded, as they were downwind from us. Finding 3 large sycamores growing close together, we stopped on the leeward side. Papa shouted above the wind, "I don't know if we can take much more of this." "It is bad," Grandpa replied. "It looks like it's going to get worse." "You can't see over 15 feet now," the judge said. "I don't think we can even find the buggy." "Oh, I think we can find the buggy, all right," Papa said. I could no longer hear the voices of my dogs, and that had me worried. I didn't want to leave them out in the storm. "Can anybody hear the hounds?" Grandpa asked. "I can't," Papa said. Now the judge spoke up. "Fellows, I think we better go in. There's no telling where they are. They may have crossed the river." Scared and knowing I had to do something, I said, "They're closer than you think, probably treed by now. You can't hear them for this wind." I just begged, "Let's go a little farther." There was no reply, and no one made a move to leave the shelter of the trees. Taking a few steps, I said, "I'll take the lead. You guys just follow me." "Billy, we couldn't find them," Papa said. "You can't see or hear a thing. We'd better start back for camp." "Well, I think so too," the judge said. At this remark, I cried. I've been out in storms like this before, all by myself. I've never left my dogs in the woods, and I'm not going to now, even if I have to look for them by myself. No one answered. The judge, "Excuse me, please, let's just go a little further," I begged. "I just know we'll hear them." Still, nobody spoke or made a move to go on. Stepping over to my father, I buried my face in his old mackinaw coat. Sobbing, I pleaded with him not to turn back. He patted my head. "Billy," he said, "a man could freeze to death in this storm, and besides, your dogs will give up and come in." "That's what has me worried," I cried. "They won't come in. They won't, Papa. Little Ann might, but not old Dan. He'd die before he'd leave a coon in a tree." Papa was undecided. Making up his mind, he stepped away from the tree and said to the others, "I'm going on with him. You fellows coming or going back?" He turned and followed me. Grandpa and the judge fell in behind him. By this time the ground was covered with a thin white layer of sleet. We kept slipping and falling. I could hear Grandpa mumbling and grumbling. The wind-driven sleet stung our skin like thousands of prickling needles. Strong gusts of wind growled and moaned through the tops of the tall timber. Once, during a momentary lull of the storm, I thought I heard the baying of a hound. I told my father I thought I had heard old Dan. "From what direction?" he asked. "From that way," I said, and pointing to our left. We started on. A few minutes later, Papa stopped. He shouted to my grandfather, "Did you hear anything?" "No," Grandpa shouted back. "I can't hear anything in this storm." "I thought I did, but I'm not sure," the judge said. "Where was it coming from?" Papa asked. "Over that way." Now the judge pointed to the right. "That's the way it sounded to me," Papa said. At that moment, all of us heard the deep voice of old Dan. "It sounds as if they're close," Grandpa said. "Let's split up," the judge said. "Maybe one of us can find them." "No," Papa said. "It'd be too easy to get lost in this storm." "I think they're more to the right of us," I said. "I do too." So we all agreed, and we trudged on. Old Dan bawled again. The sound of his voice seemed to be all around us. The way that the wind was whipping the sound through this timber, the judge said, "We'd be lucky if we ever find them." Papa shouted over the roar of the wind, "We can't take much more of this. We'll freeze to death." The men were giving up. I felt a knot again as it crawled up into my throat. Salt water froze on my eyelashes. Kneeling down, I put my ear close to the icy ground in hopes I could hear my dogs. I couldn't hear anything above the roar of the blizzard. Standing up, I peered this way and that. All I could see was a white wall of swirling sleet. I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer and hoped for a miracle. We heard a sharp crack and a loud crashing noise. A large limb torn from a tree by the strong wind fell to the ground. The sharp crack of the limb gave me an idea. Shouting to my father, I said, "Shoot the gun! If my dogs are close enough to hear it, maybe little Ann will come to us." Papa didn't hesitate. Pointing the gun high over his head, he pulled the trigger. The sharp crack rang out in the teeth of the storm, and we waited. Just when I had given up all hope and had sunk to the lowest depths of despair, out of that white wall of driving sleet, my little dog came to me. I knelt down and gathered her up in my arms. Taking one of the lead ropes from my pocket, I tied it to her collar. I said, "Find him, little girl, please. Find little Dan, old Dan." Right then, I didn't care about coons, gold cups, or anything. All I wanted was my dogs. I don't know how she did it. Straight into the face of the storm she led us. Time after time she'd stop and turn her head this way and that. I knew she couldn't scent or see anything. Instinct alone was guiding her. Over the winding and twisting trail we followed. Coming out of the bottom, she led us into the thick canebrake. The tall stalks sheltered us from the storm. The roaring of the wind didn't seem as loud, and like ghostly figures, large trees loomed almost out of the solid mass. Falling and stumbling, we kept pushing on. Grandpa shouted, "Hold up a minute, I'm just about all in." We stopped. "Do you think that hound knows what she's doing?" the judge asked. "Maybe we're just running around in circles." Looking at me, Papa said, "I hope she does. Some of these canebrakes cover miles. If we get lost in there, we'll be in bad shape." Grandpa said, "I think we've gone too far. The last time I heard old Dan, he sounded quite close." "That's because the wind carried the sound," I said. Now the judge spoke up. "Fellows, no dog is worth the lives of 3 men. Now let's do the smart thing and let's get out of here while we can. Our clothes are wet. If we keep on wandering around in this jungle, we'll freeze to death. It doesn't look like this blizzard is ever going to let up." I could hear the roar of the blizzard back in the thick timber of the bottoms. 2 large limbs began rubbing together, and the strong wind made a grinding and creaking sound. Tall, slender cane around us was rattling and swaying. I could feel the silence closing in. I knew the judge's cold logic had had its effect on my father and my grandfather. The men had given up. There was no hope left for me. Kneeling down, I put my arms around little Ann, and I felt the warm heat from her moist tongue caressing my ear. Closing my eyes, I said, "Please, Dan, bawl one more time. Just one more time." I waited for my plea to be answered. With its loud roaring, the north wind seemed to be laughing at us. All around us, tall stalks of cane were weaving and dancing in the rattling rhythm of their knife-edged blades. My father tried to talk above the wind, but his words were lost in the storm. Just before another blast, clear as a foghorn on a stormy sea, old Dan's voice rang loud and clear. It seemed louder than the roar of the wind or the skeleton-like rustling of the tall, swaying cane. I jumped to my feet. My heart did a complete flip-flop. The knot in my throat felt as big as my apple. I tried to whoop, but it was no use. Little Ann bawled and tugged on the rope. There was no mistaking direction. We knew that the land had been right all along. Straight as an arrow she had led us. Old Dan was treed down in the deep gully. I slid off to the bank and ran to him. His back was covered in a frozen layer of sleet. His frost-covered whiskers stood out straight as porcupine quills. I worked the wedges of ice from between his toes and scraped the sleet from his body with my hands. Little Ann came over and tried to wash his face. He didn't like it. Jerking loose from me, he ran over the tree, reared up on it, and started bawling. Hearing shouting from the bank above me, I looked up. I could dimly see Papa and the judge through the driving sleet. At first I thought they were shouting to me, but on peering closer I could see that they had their backs to me. Catching hold of some long stalks of cane that were hanging down from the steep bank, I pulled myself up. Papa shouted in my ear, "Something has happened to your grandfather!" Turning to the judge, he said, "He was behind you. When was the last time you saw him?" "I don't know for sure," the judge said. "I guess it was back there where we heard the hound bawl." "Didn't you hear anything?" Papa asked. "Hear anything?" the judge explained. "How could I hear anything in that noise? I thought he was behind me all the time, and didn't miss him until we got here." I couldn't hold back my tears. Grandfather was lost and wandering in that white jungle of cane. Screaming for him, I started back. Papa caught me and shouted, "Don't do that!" I tried to tear away from his grip on my arm, but it was firm. "Shoot the gun," the judge said. Papa shot time after time, and it was useless. We just got no answer. Little Ann came up out of the washout. She stood and stared at me. Turning, she quickly disappeared into the thick cane. Minutes later we heard her. It was a long, mournful cry. The only times I have ever heard my little dog bawl like that were when she was baying at the bright Arzak moon, or when someone played a French horn, or French harp, or fiddle close to her ear. She didn't stop until we reached her. Grandpa lay as he had fallen, face down on the icy sleet. His right foot was wedged into the fork of a broken box elder limb. When the ankle had twisted, the searing pain must have made him go unconscious. Papa worked Grandpa's foot free and turned him over. I sat down and placed his head in my lap. While Papa and the judge massaged his arms and legs, I wiped the frozen sleet from his eyes and his face. Burying my face in his iron-gray hair, I cried and begged God not to let my grandfather die. "I think he's gone," the judge said. "I don't think so," Papa said. "He took a bad fall where that limb tripped him, but he hasn't been lying here long enough to be frozen. I think he's just unconscious." Papa lifted him to a sitting position and told the judge to start slapping his face. Grandpa moaned and moved his head. "He's coming around," Papa said. I asked Papa if we could get him back to the gully where old Dan was. I had noticed there was very little wind there and we could build a fire. "That's the very place," he said. "We'll build a good fire and one of us can go for help." Papa and the judge made a seat by catching each other's wrists. They eased Grandpa between them. By the time we reached the washout, Grandpa was fully conscious again. He was mumbling and grumbling. He couldn't see why they had to carry him like a baby. After easing him over the bank and down into the gully, we built a large fire. Papa took out his knife and cut the boot from Grandpa's swollen foot. Papa grunted and groaned from the pain. I felt sorry for him, but there was nothing I could do but look on. Papa examined the foot. Shaking his head, he said, "Boy, that's a bad one. It's either broken or badly sprained. I'll go for some help." Grandpa said, "Now just wait a minute. I'm not going to let you go out in that blizzard by yourself. What if something happens to you? No one would know." "What time is it?" he asked. The judge looked at his watch. "Almost 5 o'clock, he said. "It's not long till daylight," Grandpa said. "And if you want to go, you can see where you're going. Now help me get propped up against this bank. I'll be all right. It doesn't hurt any more. It's numb now."